Good morning. This is Glenn Labhart from Burnet, Texas. I've spoken before with the ERPEC people. This is a little bit of a follow-up on a lot of the global issues regarding energy as it affects both the United States, Europe, Far East, and China. My background is former chairman of the Global Association of Risk Professionals, as well as handling the energy exam and as a board member. So I'll just start right off by saying, right now, as we spoke about from the last time, we were in a situation where the invasion had occurred in the Ukraine, and it was starting to affect lots of economic decisions that were required to be made either on behalf of the U.S. and alliances with other nations. But it definitely started affecting a lot of the Europeans' decisions prior to some of the other arrangements that have happened here recently. So my point is, back then, one of the things I really tried to communicate with everyone was that it was a perception that lack of supply to Europe because of Russia cutting off its gas to Germany and other nations. It required people to facilitate some sort of CapEx program or some sort of funding program, given the high inflation. As I remember saying this several times, if you don't have any gas for the winter, buy it now, and repeating that. And I still endorse that, because what has occurred now is that you have the statistics that are coming out since the time frame of the last discussion. What we've had more gas being shipped to Europe than ever before, to as many terminals that could have been made. You've also had an interesting arrangement here, and I'm going to move my head here because I want to quote this properly. What you've had here is you've had an increase of almost 60% of exports from the United States to Europe, to the world. So having said that, what does that mean? Are we really actually producing enough gas over here? Not necessarily. What we've got is, you kind of have to take that and break that down in a little bit more of a micro set of circumstances, that contractual obligations have been made on behalf of U.S. producers in an export market to supply someone over time. But much of this supply will not hit or be delivered, actually, hit being a word of just when it will be delivered, into Europe or otherwise, until 2023. So we still have to face the facts that, here at the time of what we're speaking at, we're looking at the 26th of August, but you've got winter coming, inventories and supplies that have to be built. And those inventories, what I would say is that from a trading perspective, are in strong hands. Trading companies, host governments, otherwise, there are supplies, and you can see the statistics building in Europe, but you still have less of budgetary arrangements because of inflation, that people really don't have the funding with which to buy and commit to the collateral requirements or credit agreements with which to have supply to be able to supply in between now and into Europe. And why is that? It costs money. You've seen demand go up, and you've seen market prices go up over in Europe. It's constrained people's ability to really formally execute for contracts for natural gas. So as a result of that, you find yourself where, I'll go back to what I said a moment ago, people, when I said, buy your gas now, buy it now, and I repeated myself, you also have to have put in place a hedge program to say, I need to lock in the value of what I am actually putting forth in place. So they kind of work hand in hand. I believe what you're going to see happen between now and the end of the year, and it's just the way the world works and gets communication, you will see defaults and force majeures on some contracts, and you will see substantially higher prices, where you're looking at almost $80 per MMBTU in Europe versus where we are at $10 here in the United States. And it's going to be interesting to see the constraints, because winter is yet upon us. Globally, you've seen temperatures really at much higher levels to a large extent across Europe. we've seen wildfires and other things that have been prompted because of the weather. But now you're coming out of that summer arrangements. Inventories have drawn themselves down. But as you get prepared for the winter, you have to kind of look at this and say there's requirements to be exported, but you've also got domestic requirements in the States, and you've also got domestic requirements over in Europe. So I don't think it's over. And I think it's, frankly, in my view, going to be much worse, and you're going to see much higher prices there. You've also seen from a term perspective, and when I use the word term, I define that as longer term contractual obligations. You're seeing a greater influence over here to be have capital programs put in place from the United States to export more gas to the world. But these are terminals that are being built. They're not yet built. Some of them are not yet approved. Some of them aren't fully supplied by natural gas. And I want to clarify those remarks by just stating how that works. Within the United States, we have a vast pipeline system of what we refer to as capacity. Capacity is you produce the natural gas and you ship it on a pipeline somewhere to any other parts of the United States where the demand is. Okay, we refer to being able to ship that as capacity. Well, you also have to have the capacity on a pipeline to ship it to an export terminal, be it on the United States East Coast or the Gulf Coast. Well, when you think about that, there's this world demand for export, and it requires capacity to export. You've also got U.S. demand, which we've got to have as capacity. So some of these terminals that are purportedly being built have yet to be finally approved by our government, don't have capacity or the supply capabilities to do that. And when I think that's very important to state that, because I've seen several transactions in the last couple of months where people are frankly putting deals together to build terminals for export, and it's a smart move. However, in our country, you have to show an arrangement that you have capacity to get the natural gas to the export market, which is a capital investment. That has to be what we call a firm obligation to be able to ship gas to the rest of the world, and you've got to have supply. So when you think of this globally, the demand has basically backed in itself to the supply arrangements within the United States here and pushed an area where people are expensing capital to meet this demand. But it's a very sticky wicket, because some of the supply agreements and or capacity agreements have yet to be done on some of these terminals. And the reality of it is, you can't export something that you can't ship from a wellhead that's been produced of natural gas to a facility to export if you don't have the capacity. So that's one of the things I think that is still out here, where there's been a lot of macroeconomic decisions that have been made, all for the right reasons. They're good investments. It's a good way to supply the global market, but there are many steps that have to be gone through to be able to just produce that macro expectation or macro supply more on a micro sense. Because, without supply, without capacity, all you have is something that's a paper terminal that's not yet to be built with not really any actual supply to it. So it becomes a little bit more. The concern that I have going forward is not so much that you have also had this occur. You also look at what's occurred into Europe, where the supplies, obviously, news medias have provided us. I'm not sure how you want to say that is good or bad information, or it's just information in time. But here as of like 10 hours ago, you've had reports that have been satellite images from a plant that is an LNG export terminal right outside of Finland, where they're burning gas. And everybody is claiming that you're burning gas from a Russian facility, because either A, they can't sell it in the export market, which has certainly made it harder for them to sell right now because of obviously the invasion and sanctions and so forth. But at the same time, you also have to burn natural gas. Sometimes what people don't really realize is you will damage the reservoir of a production facility if you don't burn the gas. If you just turn the gas back down into the reservoir itself cannot effectively function, and you damage it. And the capital expense that has been applied from an engineering perspective, gas has to be flared. That is just a common theme in the energy business of production. Production has to be flared. A lot of times over here, a lot of that production and flaring takes place where it has gone into, instead of burning or flaring the gas, people are now taking that excess gas and putting into gas-fired generation, which supplies some of the operations for electricity at the production facility. A lot of people have taken these, and it's very common now in West Texas in our Permian fields, where they've used it to produce electricity of gas-fired generation in very small units. And they're producing that to be able to generate electricity, which they turn into Bitcoin and sell it into the market. All types of innovative ways to handle flaring. Once again, the difference in Russia and to a large extent of Europe versus the United States and other places is how much sophistication is the equipment. You know, you've got older equipment over in Europe. You don't have maybe some of the more higher tech type circumstances. The plan is for everybody to get there, but right now you have to flare gas. And if you've got an older terminal and not enough valves or leakage or maintenance that have been applied in some of the terminals, and I don't know that I could speak intelligently about exactly why the Russians are flaring so much gas, but they're flaring it. And I would argue that they're probably flaring it for all the right reasons. Otherwise, they're going to damage their reservoir. But certainly as they have turned gas away, it's very much unfortunate as it may be that the circumstances as they have in Europe to not supply some of the pipelines. And, you know, of course, the U.S., as I've spoken about, has made up some of that demand. You still are going to have this imbalance of being able to, once you deliver the gas into Europe or anywhere into parts of the, you know, the European area, even to the Med, this gas has to be redistributed. It's got to go into a pipeline system and it has to flow efficiently. So we call that bottlenecks. A lot of times is a term we use over here in the gas industry when capacity is constrained or capacity is restricted. You know, you may be able to pull into a port with a ship, but you may not be able to deliver all the gas off ratably as you find it. And this ratable set of circumstances is most likely what I was referring to as you get into the winter. The non-ability to ratably push the gas through doesn't allow for you to have an even flow to some of the areas, and prices exist higher because someone who doesn't have enough has to go buy from somebody else in the open market. It just kind of fuels itself. So this is how markets work. It's not a perfect world, but when you're in a free market, this is what occurs. The other thing is in Europe, a lot of the distribution systems are not connected. Europe has a distribution system, and a lot of countries there have a lot of distribution systems that are within country. They're not connected to one another. We don't have that in the United States. We're connected on a very large grid. But in Europe, it's a much, much different thing. One thing also that has occurred, you've also seen where earlier in the pandemic years, the Chinese were very, very big buyers, and then they left the market. And it's because once under the invasion, I think they were of the view that they did not want to negotiate a lot of agreements to be able to, at higher prices, buy gas for some of their required circumstances. They're now coming back into the market. It's been reported that they are offering more tenders. There's a lot of negotiations going on. There's been a lot of term deals that have been effectuated. You know, the world is trying to respond from all areas of supply and distribution as best it can. I still think it's very unfortunate that the circumstances exist that even as much as in Cyprus, you know, you've had the announcement by Total that they have found gas and you otherwise have reserves there that you are not able to produce that. I'm not there with that. I don't know what the reality of the circumstances are. That's a little beyond my own personal pay grade, but it just seems to me that you've got areas of location that have just not been able to be produced, and it's problematic. You know, one of the other things too that we're being faced with in the industry, and I'll move off of natural gas and I'll move more to the renewables market, is I spoke about this the last time, ESG, which is environmental social governance. Here you have had more comments come through that have been made publicly available, yet not finally approved or authorized, where it is the expectations that financial statements will be required to disclose for companies here that are public, what are their climate change or environmental social governance requirements by the first quarter of 2023. So when you think about the timing of that, and most people right now are going into a planning mode, you're entering into the third quarter where most people and businesses are starting to develop their planning. They're looking at their budgets to be approved by their boards in their fourth quarter board meetings so they can execute following that into the next year. So as you're going through the planning cycle, it's going to be interesting to see how people budget accordingly for this incremental cost of ESG and or what are the rules, because they're not really yet defined. They're not yet there. ESG is I'm not saying is a bad thing. I think that everybody has to warrant some sort of element or participation to climate change. I just think that you've kind of got the cart before the horse a little bit here, and that you're developing requirements for people to adhere to without really necessarily proving out the technologies or the capital investments to which they will be reported. So it's like the tail wagging the dog a little bit. Sorry about my Texas accent, but you're looking at that sort of circumstance. So people here are being required in the United States to have an ESG policy, but it's very loose and different. You've had a lot of people, you probably may have heard on the news where, for instance, in Deutsche Bank circumstances, you have where they've been accused of greenwashing. Greenwashing, what does that mean? That means that they have produced results, but someone considers them fraudulently because someone didn't actually produce the right information. I think the other thing too that's more interesting, as much as you're setting the standards for this reporting for financials out in the future, you're also, I think there needs to be more of an effort pushed back to the oil companies. And this is what I think you're going to probably see. There's no question that the oil companies' profits and the investments that they've made in the last 5 to 10 years in shale drilling are now starting to pay off. But as you're starting to perhaps through the administration here in the United States to resist selling leases for them to incrementally drill to meet this demand of fossil fuels, I think you're going to start seeing more companies be restrictive on what they can do. And to me, that's where it's almost a case in the United States here where I think you're looking at companies like Exxon, Occidental, and some of the bigger producers that have also, the word they used in business school that I recall, we called it plowing the profits back into the business. They've gone out and made capital expenditures through use in their balance sheet and their fiscal management to start developing arrangements to take on carbon, which is CO2 injection, and putting that into a lot of projects here in the Gulf Coast and otherwise into the Permian. And this is where I think we need to have more effort generated, because, you can make the statement that you can reduce the climate change by getting to the masses, but the real bigger portions of it really, I think, need to go and work with a lot of the oil companies and corporations to help facilitate a lot of this reduction of CO2. So it's one of these things, I think, where there's a strategy across the board that if one size fits all, but it comes down to where it's a big business. It's a very large, it's 150 trillion, if whatever the number is, it's been quoted lately. That's the one I recall. That's going to be the change for climate change is going to effectuate. But you've got to have somebody willing to finance that, as well as also into the renewable markets. Certainly the inflationary legislation that has been passed over here, it's hard. It's been passed, it's done, it's over. Okay. Now we have to figure out how that's going to work and how that's going to be implemented. And I think that that's still out as far as how the tax credits will roll through for some of the renewables. what sort of investments are to be made, how some of these things work. My concern is, once again, I kind of come from a background of being very fundamental when looking at energy, and that it's all about supply and distribution. Somebody's got to drill for it. Somebody's got to find it. Somebody's got to produce it. It doesn't matter whether it's electricity or it's natural gas or it's crude oil or it's a molecule of black oil or resid that's got to be used for something in a utility plant. It doesn't matter, but the supply and distribution has to be maintained. One of the concerns I have is renewable is that as you start going more to renewable, what you're getting rid of is taking away fossil fuels, but you're generating a requirement in renewables to not only generate electricity, but that electricity to monitor the unit has to come from somewhere. And the incremental capabilities of a grid to take on more renewable power, it's a little different if it's not what we call base load type power. When you think of electricity in a market and you start adding in renewables, one of the things that's the best way to always think about it is we call it the wedding cake theory. A wedding cake typically is a tiered cake, and it has a base, and then it has a secondary level, then it has a higher level, and then it gets to the top, and usually there's something on the top of a bride and groom or something like that. Well, in energy, when you look at it from that perspective, your investment in baseload means it's always running. And then as demand goes up the left side of a wedding cake, and you start increasing it to the next level of the cake and then the next level and to the next level, you're turning on more generation to be able to supply reliable power. So a lot of places where you've always had, like in certain countries, you've had nuclear or gas-fired generation or coal, that's your base load. And then as you put in renewables, you have to be able to allow for the ability to bring in this generation of renewed power or renewed electricity, and it has to have the fundamental capabilities of delivering it into the grid. That's not yet fully completed. And so a lot of the studies are indicating, at least on our grid here, that as much as it is a good idea, you could put a wind farm in place or a battery in place, but you've got to have the capability of ensuring that its reliability to be able to supply power to the grid is there. And it can effectively be connected to the grid to supply that. So we use the term here in the United States when we refer to the grid sometimes as wires and pipes. Wires and pipes meaning pipes supplying something to the grid, and then wires being something that supplies into the retail circumstances. And I think that that is very, very critical, that in this case, supplying gas into the grid or power into the grid, that you always have that when these people start going after these new renewable targets, and a lot of the legislation here is that a lot of the funds that are starting to be developed to go after this new renewable plan and the new renewable arrangements, that you check all your boxes. I don't think everybody's quite checked all the boxes because energy people have not yet been involved. There's a lot of investment vehicles which are there to support the investment of this, which is quite important, but the diligence has to be adequately prepared and required so that you can effectively deliver into the grid. And there's just a lot more micro circumstances that really are required to be in place. That's really all what I'm saying. And I think that's very, very important. Certainly in the audience over on the other side of the world that I'm speaking to that is in the Mediterranean, there's been the efforts there. The reason I'm saying this is projects have to be adequately scrubbed so that the renewable power can effectively make arrangements to the grid. I think it's a good thing to have renewables. It's just that the devil's in the details, as I always say, that the level of ability to produce and the reliability of the source has to be carefully vetted much more, I think, than a lot of people give themselves credit for. It's unfortunate in today's world, news can travel fast, but those of us that have been in the field or have been doing this for quite some time in energy, it's all a good thing and it works, but you've got to go through all the proper steps to do it. not so much for just making sure of reliability, but also for safety. And that's going to be one of the things I think that people have to be very guarded against, is also in the battery storage, is the risk associated with it operationally. There have been some issues with some batteries, certainly, that have been older technology, and their technology of the batteries have become better, but some of them have started fire and pose environmental risks, such that you have to make sure that the reliability of the installation of the facility from an operational risk perspective, that those circumstances have all been covered either by insurance or a proper replacement value, because you're not going to be able to just generate electricity into a battery for storage and then not have to replace that battery. You got to kind of think of it like I'm not sure what the word is overseas. We call it a flashlight over here. I think you call it a torch elsewhere in the world. And so the torch has to have its batteries replaced at some time. It's not going to live forever. People can say that, but you know how batteries are. You have to replace them. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to be disposed? And certainly a large portion of what's affecting renewables, once again, from a global perspective, is metals. Your lithium. There's been new features that have just been come out this week from MIT, referring to new arrangements in technology to build batteries other from lithium, because of the lithium supply, which is controlled majority by China, Chile, and then you've had other areas within the world where people are starting to look to mine some of this. Some of this is here in the United States. So renewable raw materials is going to be a really critical arrangement, which of course then backs into what we all know is supply chain management. Do you have the raw materials and the ability for everybody that wants batteries to be able to get them into supply them? So it's there's a lot of things that have to be worked out, and certainly the global economies of scale have been altered, not only due to the pandemic, but also due to the sanctions, as well as also to the invasion itself. So it's going to be a little bit of a rough road, a little bit of a sticky wicket, so to speak, as you start rolling some of these things out. And I think that it's going to be real critical for a lot of people to make sure they do some of these proper planning. My assessment of the global circumstances are this: oil has come down. The OPEC nations have basically made the comment that they will produce. Now they're making comments that if they are not able to effectively meet some demand or there's too much supply, then they'll back it off a little bit. You're going back to a lot of the older fundamentals, and you can't certainly blame anybody that is really just looking at how do I manage my production? How do I manage my global refining? Because frankly, you're at max capacity on refining. There's not much more that you can do with refining. You can't just flip a switch and turn a refinery on. You got to work through 90 days of inventory. And as such, you've got to take maintenance down on some of these refineries. So as a lot of the production facilities are producing at max capacities for the OPEC nations, as well as here in the States and other places, you've got to have planned maintenance periods. And that's why I think a lot of people have to really be concerned about in watching inventories, is you have to really take into account the fundamentals of the market, that the fundamentals of the market are going to require maintenance. So you're going to see these pockets of supply circumstances, as I've talked about earlier. What I think will happen in Europe with the higher prices for energy, you've got to slow it down just a little bit to make sure you can meet the demand of what's coming. So it's going to be an interesting fourth quarter. A lot more, I think, than people really realize, and certainly the news will help us to take the unfortunate circumstances that will occur and maybe blow it out of proportion. But I think that the oil companies and majority of the utilities in the world have made some very, very good decisions in supplying themselves and being able to effectively deliver. But you are going to see a lot of micro circumstances that will be there. So, with that, I think that's really where I stand on the markets right now. I don't know that I have a real crystal ball into a lot of the socioeconomic circumstances on behalf of the government, because I'm like anybody else. I can only listen to and assess what I hear based on my background and my information. But I find that there are a lot of transactions in the market right now. People are certainly keeping it as business as usual on a global sense to continue to supply the world with natural gas, oil. And the biggest thing that we have to be, I think the world has to be careful about is that you are in an inflationary period and but it's a whole nother ballgame of economics right now. Listening to a lot of the people up in Jackson Hole right now with the economists, everybody's textbooks, let's just say, are rewritten because we're on new ground with a lot of the economics. And I think that's going to affect a lot of decisions. So it certainly will not be dull. It just means that I think for a lot of people in their companies in their own respective circumstances, they have to weigh very carefully the circumstances outlying what their production levels are or their required purchasing levels are, and don't be caught without something, once again, physically that you need to be able to have that, and also the collateralization and the operational arrangements within your respective legal agreements such that force majeure and things like that don't occur. So, with that, I thank ERPIC for allowing me the time to share my thoughts and views, and we'll look forward to further discussions at a later time.